In the summer of 1940, a crucial air battle rages in the skies over southern England. Britain is under attack.
Without any warning, and suddenly about a dozen or so 109s came down on us out of the sun.
The sky was full of Messerschmitt 109s with yellow noses, swastikas and big black crosses on them.
Churchill has warned of this, a battle of Britain upon which the freedom of the British people will depend. One aircraft will become a symbol of the British will to resist, to fight on and win.
It was such a wonderful machine to fly because it turned, slipped, side slip, do all of the things that you had to do in combat so easily.
I'm very proud of the fact that I was involved in the design and the development of the aircraft.
It is the most beautiful aircraft I have ever flown in my life, and it was a fighter.
The story of the Spitfire begins in 1931. In competition for the Schneider Trophy, the Supermarine S6B designed by Reginald Mitchell achieves a speed of 340 miles per hour. It's the third Schneider Cup win for a Mitchell-designed aircraft.
Mitchell was a brilliant designer. He was a very, very good leader. He was an easy man to get on with. He did have his occasional flare-ups, but one of his main advantages was that he was able to pick the right people to do the job.
At this time, the biplanes of the RAF can barely reach speeds of 220 miles per hour. Alarmed at Britain's vulnerability to the threat of aerial attack, the Royal Air Force invites proposals for a single-seat fighter. At Supermarine, Mitchell's design, known as Type 224, proves disappointing. It's underpowered, with a poor rate of climb and a top speed of hardly 240 miles per hour. The Air Ministry awards the production contract to the Gloucester Gladiator, a biplane with a top speed of 250 miles per hour. Mitchell, unhappy with design compromises made to fit the Air Ministry's specifications, begins work on plans for a completely new type of fighter plane.
He started to design an aircraft to his own ideas, which had 8 guns firing forward. It had an enclosed cockpit, retractable undercarriage, and all of the refinements which would need to be used to produce something with a very high speed. He had also introduced the concept of stressed skin construction, where in fact instead of just making a structure which was self-supporting of its own and then putting plating on it, the external plating actually took some of the stress as well. And that lesson was carried on into the design of what became the Spitfire.
Mitchell will incorporate into his design a new advanced aero engine being developed by the Rolls-Royce company, a 12-cylinder 1,000 horsepower water-cooled power plant, the PV-12. Later, it would be called the Merlin.
When the 15,000 parts that go to make up the Merlin have been assembled, they are by the last test but one.
The new aircraft, designated Type 300, bears little relation to the 224. Mitchell had used an elliptical wing in a previous design project of his. Now he uses it again.
He had engaged a team of experts, specialists, aerodynamicists, structural engineers, mathematicians and so on. The principal aerodynamicist was a man named Beverly Shenstone, and he was the man who was responsible for the design of the wing section and of its shape.
In December 1934, Mitchell's latest plans are shown to the Air Ministry. With its all-metal stress-skin monocoque fuselage, utilising light alloys and its elliptical wing shape, the Type 300 is a radical departure from the conventional wood and fabric assemblies of current RAF machines. The need for an advanced fighter grows ever more urgent. Hitler has embarked on a massive expansion of the German armed forces. For Mitchell, there is added urgency. He is suffering from cancer. The British Air Ministry is keeping Mitchell's project under close scrutiny. Realising its potential, they create an individual specification to accommodate his design. The 5th of March 1936, the prototype finally takes to the air. The test flight is a complete success. As the prototype achieves a speed of 335 miles an hour, those watching realise it's all they had hoped and planned for. But Mitchell himself remains dissatisfied with its performance. Meanwhile, the RAF is expanding. Young men eager to become pilots volunteer for service.
I decided that I would like to learn to fly, but I found that learning to fly through private sources would have been somewhat expensive for a young teenager. I thought was one way of doing it, and that's to apply to the Air Force.
I marched up to the old Air Ministry building, which was in Kingsway in those days, and I walked in and got hold of the commissioner and said, I wanted to be a pilot, what do I do?
Went to the recruiting office and said I wanted to be a pilot. And he said, well, you can't volunteer to be a pilot. He said, you can volunteer to be air crew. He said, and if you're good enough, you might become a pilot. So I said, all right, I'll volunteer for air crew. So he said, right, well, what's your name and address, and what does your father do, and what's your job? So I said, well, I work at Supermarine. So he said, what do you do at Supermarine? I said, well, I'm an apprentice. Apprentice, he said. He looked me in the eye, and he picked up the piece of paper, and he just tore it in half, and he said, you go back to work, my son. He said, you're doing a better job there.
This latest intake of eager recruits continue to receive flying training on biplanes, soon to be outdated by Mitchell's prototype monoplane fighter.
The training aeroplane at 604 Squadron was the Avro 504N. That was a slightly later version of the Avro 504 that was built and used in the 1914-18 war.
I went to Grantham, which was a flying training school, flying Harts and Hinds, which again were pretty old aircraft, but that's all they had.
In spite of increasing ill health, Mitchell oversees further development of the propeller and exhaust systems, which increased the speed of the prototype to almost 350 miles an hour.
All Supermarine aircraft had names which started with the letter S. It was originally going to be called the Shrew. But what I've said is, with a name like that, we'd have lost the war.
Meanwhile, Nazi Germany's rearmament program continues apace. In response, the British government steps up the expansion of the RAF and orders 310 Spitfires. At the time, the largest single order for aircraft ever placed by the RAF. The 11th of June 1937, the far-sighted aircraft designer Reginald Mitchell dies at the age of 42. He does not live to see the Spitfire's finest hour. News of Mitchell's death has a profound effect on the workforce.
Mitchell's death certainly had quite an impact on the people in the design department. And I remember, in fact, the day that he died, Black and I were working in the laboratory on something, I don't know what now. We both sort of stopped what we were doing, looked at one another, silence for a bit, and then got on with the job.
Work continues with Joe Smith, Mitchell's assistant, taking over as chief designer. But getting the Spitfire into full production is causing huge problems. The Supermarine works at Woolston is not geared up to manufacture such large numbers. The government builds a huge factory at Castle Bromwich to shadow the work at Woolston. Lord Nuffield, who ceremonially starts work on the foundations, is put in charge of the new factory. It's hoped that his experience of the mass production of motor cars will speed production of the Spitfire. Due to the difficulties of manufacturing the revolutionary elliptical wing and complex airframe, the Spitfire does not lend itself to mass production. New assembly techniques have to be mastered by a workforce unused to the sophistication of Mitchell's design.
You had to be fairly agile to work on it. You had to be prepared to bend your arms into funny places. To be honest, they weren't an easy airplane to work on. When they were designed, I think they were designed by someone drawing on a piece of paper. They didn't actually have to do what we did.
Meanwhile, orders are being placed for the RAF's only other monoplane fighter, the Hawker Hurricane. Based on the wood and fabric design of the biplanes that preceded it, and almost 50 miles an hour slower than the Spitfire, the Hurricane is a sturdy, uncomplicated aircraft, simpler to build, and is soon in service with the RAF. As 1938 draws to a close, a further 200 Spitfires are ordered by the RAF. War now looks inevitable.
We were told there weren't going to be any more Munichs, and that the factory had got to be on a war footing by Easter of 1939.
The 4th of August, 1938. The first Spitfires are delivered to an operational RAF squadron.
Sitting in the Spitfire cockpit for the first time, to hear the roar of the Merlin engine, it's the most wonderful noise you can imagine. It's sort of rich and powerful and reassuring, and it was wonderful. And so I taxied out with very mixed feelings, because you have to realize, first of all, that I was flying what we considered to be the best and fastest fighter aircraft in the world.
When I saw my first Spitfire, and I was so impressed with it, because in appearance, you couldn't have a more beautiful machine than the Spitfire.
The Spitfire was certainly more of a, not necessarily maneuverable, but it was more powerful. It seemed somehow as though you fitted into a Spitfire.
With a maximum speed of 362 miles per hour, able to climb to 20,000 feet in 9.5 minutes, and a wing design that makes it highly maneuverable, the Spitfire pilots learn to appreciate the qualities of this remarkable aircraft.
The Spitfire aircraft was a marvellous aeroplane to fly. You had to be careful on the ground because you had such a narrow undercarriage and it tended to be nose heavy. But once you got the aircraft into the air, it was a wonderful aircraft to fly.
But also, of course, it was such a wonderful machine to fly because it was so sensitive to its controls. It turned, side slip, do all of the things that you had to do in combat so easily in a Spitfire.
The Spitfire looked as if it could fly. Looked as if it was designed to fly. It was a beautiful aircraft to look at. It was a beautiful design. Like with some tall people, it was a bit of a disadvantage. But being a short arse, it was, it just suited me grand.
It became natural to you. I mean, a Spitfire, the only way I describe flying a Spitfire is you don't fly a Spitfire, you just strap it on and fly. It is the most beautiful aircraft I have ever flown in my life.
April 1939. In spite of production problems at the new Castle Bromwich factory, the Royal Air Force places an order for over 1,000 Spitfires. The 1st of September 1939, Germany invades Poland.
Within the first 4 days, you see, it was obvious. They were just moving and rolling their armor, and the German Air Force going in advance, bombing and softening the targets. The Polish Air Force, unfortunately, had outdated equipment. We were overwhelmed by the power of the Luftwaffe, and we suffered heavy losses, and we had to withdraw.
At 11 o'clock on September the 3rd, 1939, Britain declares war on Germany. Fewer than 350 of the 2,000 Spitfires now on order have been delivered to the RAF. It is the time of the so-called phony war, a period of uncertainty, of waiting. The sense of frustration is felt by many pilots, including Geoffrey Quill, Supermarine's chief test pilot. He shares his doubts with Alex Henshaw, who has joined Supermarine as a test pilot at Castle Bromwich, following a record-breaking career in air racing.
And Geoffrey Quill said to me, he said, you know, I think this bloody war's going to fizzle out. And he said, I don't think the Spitfire will ever go into production. And I think we both agreed that it was a difficult aircraft to produce. It was also very costly. And, of course, at that time, the qualities of the Spitfire, whilst they're appreciated by people like myself and other qualified pilots, no one had really any indication as to how they'd stand up.
The 16th of October 1939, and the first enemy aircraft to be destroyed by Fighter Command fall to Spitfires of 602 and 603 squadrons. A formation of bombers is intercepted over the Firth of Forth in Scotland, and 2 enemy aircraft are destroyed. With Spitfire production still plagued by construction and supply problems, Hawker Hurricanes are reaching squadrons in far greater numbers, and it's Hurricanes and their pilots that are sent to support British troops in France.
3 days after war was declared, they posted our squadron to France, along with 3 other Hurricane squadrons. Initially, we didn't do much at all. We were moving around trying to get settled into various airfields.
In May 1940, the Netherlands, Luxembourg and Belgium fall to the blitzkrieg of Hitler's forces en route to France. The Hurricane squadrons are overwhelmed as the Luftwaffe sweeps ahead of the advancing German army. Resistance collapses. Refugees fill the roads as the German army drives on towards the French coast. Spitfires fly from their airfields in southern England. They are ordered to intercept Luftwaffe warplanes trying to destroy the British Army as it evacuates from the beaches.
We linked up with another squadron, and so we flew as a pair about 70, 80 miles across the sea to Dunkirk. Well, you could see Dunkirk miles away because there's enormous column of smoke from the burning oil tanks and things. And we were about 15,000 feet and flying around, not seeing anything at all. Then, without any warning at all, suddenly the sky was full of Messerschmitt 109s with yellow noses, swastikas and big black crosses on them. And this was very much a moment of truth.
For most of the Luftwaffe pilots, this is their first encounter with the Spitfire.
This was our first contact with the Royal Air Force, and we had a big respect. I also want to add, the Royal Air Force was still flying in a 3-ship formation, but then changed to a 4-ship, because it is more flexible. We witnessed all this, and experienced the advantages and disadvantages that came with it. For example, when a Spitfire rose with a tight turn, we were unable to follow. They are better.
The Messerschmitt and the Spitfire are closely matched, but the Me-109E is armed with 2 7.9mm machine guns firing through its propeller, and 2 cannons mounted on its wings firing explosive 20mm shells. The Spitfire's 8.303 machine guns cannot match their firepower. Spitfire pilots have to ensure their fire is close, concentrated and sustained to cause lethal damage to enemy aircraft.
I had a lot of bullet holes in the body of the plane. A few on the wings, but none that would have influenced the flying ability of the plane. I was only able to escape from the Spitfire because I turned the plane upside down and flew off with full speed. The Spitfire was lighter and could not catch up with the sinking Me-109.
With the collapse of France, the Luftwaffe is now free to concentrate against Britain from bases just across the English Channel. It's crucial that Spitfire production is stepped up at Castle Bromwich if the Royal Air Force is to defend the skies over southern England.
And our backs were to the wall, and by God, we needed aircraft. So to some degree there was a panic to try and see if Castle Bromwich could be put into production with the Spitfires. Beaverbrook trapped Nuffield into resigning, and then Supermarine came into the picture to take over, not necessarily the running of the factory, but at least to guide them in the right direction to start production.
Full Spitfire production is finally underway, and not a moment too soon.
And then, of course, it was a question of almost in desperation, getting Spitfires out, getting them tested, and getting them to the battle stations.
The Luftwaffe has 2,700 operational aircraft at its disposal. The Royal Air Force will meet this threat with barely 650 fighter aircraft that are operational and ready for action. 230 of these are Spitfires.
But the fact of the matter is, I think those people like myself realised that within weeks we could have the Germans landing on this island of ours, and certainly people like myself were not going to surrender, and there'd be a lot more like them. But we realised that no way we're going to win. And I think, quite frankly, that if it was put to me bluntly, are we going to win this war? I think we just said, we should be bloody lucky if we do.
The Spitfire is about to face its greatest challenge. June 1940. The German armed forces have swept all before them. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. The Spitfire will face the Messerschmitt in a fighter-against-fighter duel for control of the skies.
It was a vital battle. After all, the Germans wanted to invade us, and they couldn't have invaded us unless they'd got air superiority.
When we started, we had command. Our bombers flew to England to win the war, to deactivate, decimate, kill the British fighter planes. We believed that we would win the war. This was the beginning, and now I was able to show what a talented and experienced pilot I was.
swarms of German fighters attempt to draw the British squadrons into battle.
We realized that they only took off when there was a bomb threat. So then we brought bombers along that were also bombing British air bases. The British fighter planes came up to shoot down the bombers.
British fighters are scrambled to meet the threat. Single squadrons, guided by radar, hit the German raiders hard and fast.
You looked, and your absolute stomach was in a knot, and you couldn't see them. When you eventually saw them, it gave you a much more settled feeling, even though all hell was going to let loose when you started niggling up.
It was a steep learning curve, trying to pick up enemy aircraft. You have to almost adjust your eyesight to it. Knowing the performance of your aircraft. For instance, someone would shout brake. I pulled round in a steep turn and stall the aircraft. And so it was learning on the job the whole time. And if you survive that period, of course, your chances of getting through and coming out alive were somewhat much better.
Nothing was going through your mind. You were just thinking of all the drill you'd taught yourself, how to avoid being shot down. And you're looking behind yourself every 10 seconds, 15 seconds, to make sure no one's behind you. You would just concentrate on, and then when you did see someone, you went in like at least I always went in like a bullet's China shop, because I reckon that's the best way to get in there.
Mitchell's vision of a superlative fighting aircraft is realized as the Spitfires of the RAF clash with the Me-109s of the Luftwaffe.
The Spitfire was superior to the Messerschmitt in my view.
But Spitfires of the Battle of Britain do have their shortcomings. Unlike the petrol injection systems that feed the engines of the Me-109s, the Spitfire's Merlin engine uses a float-type carburettor, which is affected by G-forces. When the aircraft is put into a sudden dive, the engine, starved of fuel, momentarily loses power.
In the early days, I pushed my stick hard forward to get away from it. But in the Spitfire, if you did that with not having petrol inject, your engine cut out. So you found yourself in a worse position than you were in the beginning.
The Spitfire could outturn German fighters, and so when he saw that he is losing in the turn, that eventually I will get on his tail, so he thought, well, there is no future there, so he just simply put his nose down and went down.
The pilots soon learn how to overcome the problem.
If I had simply pushed the nose of my Spitfire down to chasing it, I would have lost speed. So what I did instead of pushing the nose down was to do a sweeping left turn, taking the plane down at the same time, and did it in such a way that I came out just about 150 or so yards behind the 190 and fired at it, and it was quite successful.
Another problem soon becomes apparent.
When a 109 went into a dive, it was very, very difficult to keep up with them. And especially with Spitfires.
At that time, the ailerons were fabric covered, so you couldn't hold it steady in a dive, because as you got up to high speed, so that because of the fabric on the covering, the shape changed.
After I got to a certain speed, I started losing control. The aircraft was turning away. I couldn't keep it straight any longer. So the things, that game, but you're learning all the time.
In these battles, the vital importance of Mitchell's vision will be recognized, and the reputation of the Supermarine Spitfire as the aircraft that will save the nation is established. The Royal Air Force is fighting for survival against an enemy determined to wipe it out. As German bombers endeavour to strike at essential ground targets, it's the fighter aircraft of both sides that will determine the outcome. Britain's air defence system of detection and command and control is the finest in the world. As the radar stations situated around the coast feed information into the system, and plotting tables fill with the tracks of incoming raids, the controllers must decide how to meet these threats. The Hurricane, a sturdy, stable gun platform, is tasked with the job of attacking the bombers. The Spitfires, because of their superior performance, will tackle the hordes of deadly fighters that swarm around the bomber formations.
But the Spitfires, in both units I flew with during the battle, their main object was to look after the 109s, the fighters. We were virtually told to stay away from the bombers. And the first thing that seemed to always happen, someone would call break when we were being bounced by 109s. That you realise you were in a dangerous game and they were playing for keeps.
Without any warning, and suddenly about a dozen or so 109s came down on us out of the sun. We didn't see them, we didn't hear anything until somebody shouted, "Break, break, break, for Christ's sake, break." And there was a 109 right in front of me who had either followed me down or followed someone else down. And he didn't see me, so that was one to me.
At the start of the Battle of Britain in July, the RAF is receiving 80 new Spitfires a month. By August, production has tripled, and 245 new Spitfires are delivered to replace the 133 destroyed in combat. Though the Hurricane makes up the bulk of Fighter Command's strength and will account for more enemy aircraft destroyed, it's the distinctive shape of the Spitfire that catches the people's imagination. High above them, in the summer skies of England, they recognise the powerful beauty of Mitchell's design, and the Spitfire legend is born.
They stood for something as far as the Battle of Britain was concerned. It was an airplane that people could relate to for some reason. Because it's a unique airplane, you could recognise it.
And on those clear days, you would see them going round and round and smoke. No sound. I don't remember any sound from them at all, other than seeing these specks in the sky fighting one another.
We used to go in as a wing, 2 squadrons of Hurricanes and 2 squadrons of Spitfires. We would squirt down a whole line of bombers. So by the time we got off the end of squirting at a whole line of bombers, all hell was let loose.
Suddenly, we were attacked from all directions by Hurricanes and Spitfires. Unfortunately, most of the group, which was not that strong anymore, dispersed. Sadly, they were all shot down. About 7 pilots and planes from our group were brought down that day.
The Spitfire has got a tighter turning circle, about the same at full speed. But when you are head-to-head, you must get out by turning upside down and straight into the next cloud.
The German leadership were not accurately informed. They were not in a position to judge the Royal Air Force correctly and issue us with appropriate orders. The Royal Air Force was much stronger than we had assumed.
But the strength of the Royal Air Force does not rest solely on the Spitfire.
There's a split section between those that favour the Hurricane or give credence to the Hurricane, probably more than the Spitfire. But the fact of the matter is simply this, that the Battle of Britain could have been won by the Spitfire, but had we not had the Spitfire, the Hurricane could not have won it on its own. It's as simple as that.
The Spitfire has played a crucial role in the battle for freedom of the skies over Britain. The Mark V Spitfire enters service in February 1941. It is now armed with two 20mm Hispano cannons, as well as its machine guns. These latest variants occasionally cause problems.
Now, the Spitfires had 20mm cannons and the machine guns. And on the old one, where you had 8 machine guns, you had a kind of button which, when it was on safe, your thumb wouldn't fit into it. When you twisted it, your thumb fit into it on your stick, on your control column. And so it was a very positive, safe or fire. On this, on the top of your stick, you had this tiny little lever, and one way it was cannons, the other way it was machine gun, and some other way it was safe, and one other way it was both of them. See this 109 coming towards me, over at the same level as me, which is straight at me. And I think, well, I've got the good chance here because I've got 2 cannons, 4 machine guns, he's got 1 cannon. And I thought, right, if he comes at me, and I kept straight at him, and all of a sudden he pulls his nose up, shows his belly to me, and I then worried whether I'd blow him out of the sky and blow myself up too. And I lifted up, I pushed, and nothing happened. And I'd gone the thing on safe.
The Royal Air Force is determined to take the fight to the enemy. Hoping to draw the Luftwaffe into battle, Fighter Command begins a series of large fighter sweeps over enemy-occupied France. The Spitfire is operating at the limit of its range. The British pilots are now as disadvantaged as the Luftwaffe pilots operating over England the year before.
Now, to get across there, we should go down to Manston, refuel at Manston. It's too far across the water to be across the coast without being shot down between Blackburn. You spend 40 minutes flying across the water, and all your fuel gone. You fly around, what, 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Yeah, all, a little time there, and then you time back in. They weren't very successful because the loss of life was too great for the time spent over there.
And the Spitfire Mark Vs now come face to face with early versions of the latest German fighter aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190. With a top speed of almost 400 miles an hour, the FW-190 executes turns and maneuvers at speeds that amaze British pilots, who clash with this lethal aircraft and live to tell the tale. It soon earns the nickname Butcherbird. To counter this threat, the Spitfire's engineers worked to develop a further variant of Mitchell's original design.
We also had to make sure that we were keeping one step ahead of the enemy. And when the Focke-Wulf 190 came around, we had to increase the maneuverability of the aircraft. We actually added power-assisted ailerons. Like the power-assisted steering you got on your motor car now, but we were doing that on airplanes long before they thought of putting them in motor cars.
They are given unexpected help when a Focke-Wulf pilot lands his aircraft at an RAF airfield by mistake. The German machine is examined closely. June 1942, the Spitfire Mark IX enters service.
When you see the 9 in action, you'll notice all the familiar Spitfire features. The wing shape, the curved underside and small fin and rudder, and don't forget the new features,
the longer nose with the pigeon breast beginning to disappear, and the two symmetrical radiators. That's the Mark 9.
With a top speed of nearly 410 miles an hour, the Mark 9 restores the balance against the Focke-Wulf 190. With the Allied invasion of Europe, there is now a need for an aircraft capable of low-level attacks in support of the advancing Allied armies.
Later, the wings were clipped to give better maneuverability at low altitudes.
But the Spitfire is vulnerable to damage from the mass of small arms fire and flak that greets these low-level sorties.
They had radiators and coolant and, you know, rather in the car. If somebody puts a bullet through the front of your car, you don't even get as far as the top end of the road. Well, it's rather the same with the fighter. If you were shot in the coolant system, the engine would seize in about 4 minutes. It had run out of coolant.
The Spitfire was designed as a fighter interceptor, and a new generation of fighter bombers will prove more successful in the ground attack role, such as the powerful and sturdy Typhoon. It's a tribute to the advanced thinking behind Mitchell's original design that it is able to accommodate continuous upgrading to meet the demands made upon it, from high-altitude photo reconnaissance to carrier-borne operations.
From the prototype, Rolls-Royce, of course, operated the engine continuously all the way through the war. The aircraft got heavier and heavier and faster and faster. So that was the stream of development which took place.
The Spitfire is the only Allied fighter aircraft to stay in production and see continuous service for the duration of the Second World War. By the end of the war, it's nearly a third heavier, can climb 10,000 feet higher, and is 100 miles an hour faster. But the world has entered the jet age, and the Spitfire's days as an operational combat aircraft are numbered.
Gradually, it tailed off. You know, came a time when there's no more Spitfires being used by the RAF. We knew the time was coming when something was going to happen. So the contract for Mark 24s, but by then the RAF, they didn't want them, they wanted jet planes.
The Spitfire continues in operational service with the RAF until 1954. Over 22,500 Spitfires of all marks and variants had been built and had flown in every theatre of war. R.J. Mitchell's advanced aerodynamic design had been the secret of the Spitfire's effectiveness and longevity as a fighter aircraft.
One of the things that I heard Mitchell say on a number of occasions, if it looks good, it is good. And it was. I think we all of us felt some sort of pride because we knew very well that we got a good one.
It was the grace and beauty of the design, as well as the power of the aircraft, that captured the affection of those who flew it.
I fell a bit in love with this airplane. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and it was a fighter.
The Spitfire, in all its power and beauty, has come to represent the spirit that saved the country in those desperate days when Britain stood alone.
The aura of the Spitfire is such that it's in a class of its own. No matter how long the world goes on, the Spitfire will be recognised that was responsible for contributing to the victory greater than any other aircraft in the history of combat.